What year is it right now? Might sound like a crazy question to ask, but what if I told you that no matter what year you're watching this video, it's not actually the year you think it is, at least according to this conspiracy theory. According to the Phantom Time conspiracy, nearly 300 years of history never actually happened. Let's unpack this. So it's probably best to start with a brief overview of what the Phantom Time conspiracy is. I know I need some context because I never heard of this before today. Prepare yourselves because this one is pretty bizarre. In a nutshell, the Phantom Time conspiracy claims that a large part of the early Middle Ages, roughly between 614 and 911 AD, never happened. And it's not just saying history played out differently than what we've been taught during that time period, it's saying that those years just never happened at all. According to this conspiracy, historical records from this time period are either falsified or misinterpreted, meaning about 297 years were just made up. So the year isn't 2024, it's more like 1727. Now, why would this have happened? Well, let's just say if the Phantom Time conspiracy was meant to be a fictional piece of entertainment, the character motivations would be just slightly off. Anyway, we're gonna get into the weeds here and go over who came up with this conspiracy, why they believe it, etc, etc. Phantom Time conspiracy was first proposed by a German historian and author named Heribert Illig in 1991. He claimed that 297 years were added to the calendar by Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and possibly the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. As for why, more on that in a minute. First, let's get into Heribert Illig himself. Illig was born in 1947 in Germany. His career is really centered around his interest in historical revisionism, which is all about reinterpreting history. His career took off in 1989 when he started working as the editor at the journal Prehistory, Protohistory, Present. In 1995, he started his own publishing company called Mantis Verlag. Under this publishing company, he's released a number of books, but he is by far most famous for his work centered around the Phantom Time conspiracy. I mean, it's all that comes up when you Google his name. He's written and published a number of books, but there's not even so much as a dedicated Wikipedia article on this guy. So, is this a case of the truth being silenced, or is he just out of his mind? That's what we're here to discuss. Illig began forming his theory when he started noticing what he thought were big gaps and inconsistencies in the history of the early Middle Ages. Illig pointed to several pieces of evidence, or what he considered evidence anyway. For one, he thought there was a noticeable lack of archaeological evidence for the period between 614 and 911 AD. Again, we'll dive more into that. Another big part of Illig's argument is the calendar. He believed there were flaws in the Julian calendar, which was used before the Gregorian calendar that we use today. He also doubted the existence of some major historical figures like Charlemagne, suggesting that they were fictional characters created to fill in the historical blanks. So why were nearly 300 years of history supposedly fabricated? What possible reason could these three powerful men have had to concoct such a strange scheme? Well, they wanted history to place them at the dawn of the year 1000 AD. But again, why? What is the significance of this year? Well, mostly it just sounds better. 1000, it's a nice clean number. Seems like a pretty outlandish reason to not just rewrite history but completely fabricate 300 years worth of history to me. I mean, just a bit of a hassle, ain't it? But according to the theory, Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII cooked all of this up. You see, Otto III, who reigned from 996 to 1002 AD, officially, of course, he was a young and ambitious emperor who wanted to rule a grand empire that would rival ancient Rome. So Otto, along with the Pope, decided to rewrite history to make it appear as though they were living in the prestigious year 1000 AD. Again, it just sounds like a more iconic year. As the head of the Catholic Church, Sylvester had the influence and the authority to alter historical records and calendars to fit their fabricated timeline. And then there's the Byzantine emperor, who's also said to be implicated, but his involvement is a bit more speculative. So the three men added 297 years of fake history to the early medieval period to pull off their little deception. And everything that supposedly happened between 614 and 911 AD, just throw it out. Never actually happened, according to this. There was no Charlemagne, no Viking raids on England during that time. Events were invented, and the so-called evidence about the time, that was all just planted to be discovered centuries later. And then they of course ordered their followers to support and help spread this bogus history to make it all look real. But I mean, what is the proof that 300 years of human history have been completely fabricated? I mean, did Illig just make this statement with nothing to back it up? Well, no, not exactly anyway. He had to have something, to fill his book up with. One of his biggest pieces of so-called evidence to support his theory is the lack of archaeological evidence from 614 to 911 AD, at least according to him. Illig and others, because yes, there are other people that believe this too, well, they suggest that if nearly 300 years of history were real, we should find more artifacts, buildings, and other historical evidence from that time. They point out that while there are a number of discoveries from the periods before and after, the evidence for the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries seems pretty thin by comparison. For example, they argue there are fewer coins, fewer ruins of buildings, and not a whole lot of advancements during this time period. History shows it to be a pretty stagnant time, which according to them makes it seem more like lazy writing rather than actual documented history. One of the examples they often bring up is the lack of construction projects. If the years between 1614 and 911 AD really existed, wouldn't we have more medieval architecture dating from those centuries? But what about the written records? While there is some writing from the time too, Illig argues that it's just forged or misdated. He believes that rulers and scribes also intentionally again altered these records to fit the new fabricated timeline, making it appear as though those years actually happened. But at the heart of this conspiracy is of course the calendar. Heribert Illig claims that there is a significant mismatch in the calendar, which he says supports the idea that nearly 300 years of history were fabricated. So to understand this, we need to look at the transition from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar in 1582. The Julian calendar was introduced by Julius Caesar in 46 BC, but it was off by about 11 minutes per year because it didn't perfectly match the solar year. Over the centuries, these small errors added up, causing the calendar to drift out of sync with the seasons. By 1582, this drift had become significant enough that Pope Gregory XIII decided to fix it, introducing the Gregorian calendar, which included a more accurate leap year system. To realign the calendar with the seasons, 10 days were then skipped. October 4th of 1582 was immediately followed by October 15th of 1582. So if you look up that date, October 5th, 1582 doesn't actually exist. Illig noticed something odd here though. He argued that given the Julian calendar's inaccuracy, the difference between the Julian calendar and the actual solar year should have been about 13 days by 1582, not just 10. This discrepancy of 3 days led him to conclude that roughly 3 centuries had been added to the calendar, meaning those years never actually existed. But let's get into counter arguments now, starting with this calendar thing. The Gregorian calendar reform was not meant to align the calendar with how it was in 45 BC, but with how it was in 325 AD during the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea had set the date for Easter based on the vernal equinox, which they fixed on March 21st in the Julian calendar. By 1582, the actual equinox was happening around March 10th in the Julian calendar, but Easter was still calculated from March 21st. This mismatch was the reason for the 10-day correction. Illig's so-called the missing centuries correspond to the 369 years between the institution of the Julian calendar in 45 BC and the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. But I think the simpler counter-argument to this is these next couple points. The conspiracy is just entirely Eurocentric. The fact of the matter is, there's an entire world with people on it living outside of Europe with their own historical records and artifacts from these so-called missing years. Between 614 and 911 AD, the Islamic Golden Age was happening. There were incredible advancements in science, mathematics, medicine, culture, and the Islamic Empire left behind tons of historical records and architecture that correspond to this time. Chinese history during this period is also well documented. Chinese scholars kept the detailed records of events, scientific discoveries, and we can't forget the astronomical observations that align perfectly with the established timeline. And the same goes places like India, Japan, and the Americas, which have their own historical records and all the archaeology to go along with it. Now you could say that, well, all this stuff was just falsified as well. Leaders from around the world were all implicated, they're all in cahoots with this scheme, but I mean, no. You don't honestly believe that, do you? The entire world colluding like that? Just so an emperor overseas could say he began his rule in 1000 in the year of his Lord, even though a lot of them weren't even on board with or aware of Jesus anyway? Yeah, no. And even aside from how fractured and at odds the world was, especially during this time, the logistics of a massive, coordinated global conspiracy like this actually working is incredibly far-fetched. But even if we do stick to Europe, there's still proof that these years did in fact take place. There are artifacts and architectural evidence of the period. Artifacts include everyday items. You got coins, tools, pottery, weapons, ruins of buildings, all this stuff that the conspiracy says there's not enough of. Well, first let's talk about dating methods. Scientists use dendrochronology, also known as tree ring dating, which analyzes the patterns of tree rings. Each year a tree adds a new ring, and the thickness of these rings varies with environmental conditions. By comprising the tree ring patterns in a piece of ancient wood to a master chronology, scientists can figure out almost the exact year the tree was cut down. They also use radiocarbon dating and a number of other methods to determine what time period artifacts would have been made. Now, addressing the whole question of why there might not be a whole bunch of architecture from the period, well, first off, the early Middle Ages, kind of a crazy time. It was nothing but, it was just war all the time, invasions, takeovers, buildings would get destroyed on a fairly regular basis. And aside from the sturdier castles from the time, which we do have evidence of some of today, a lot of other buildings from this period were less sturdy, made from wood, which decays over time. Anyway, this is a whole rabbit hole we could just dive down into. But definitely an interesting conspiracy theory, pretty bizarre. Let me know your thoughts on this one down in the comments. With all that said though, I've been your host James, and I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.